Now, how will the readers of the future know when this comes? How will they know that Jesus is coming soon? What sign? That's what started all this. Remember that? Back in verse 7. What is the sign when the end is coming? What is the sign of your coming, as Matthew puts it? What is the sign of the end of the age? What is the sign? What should we look for to know that it's going to happen? Of course, they thought it would happen then, soon. We're 2,000 years later. It hasn't happened. Christ hasn't established His kingdom. What is there to look for that generation that's alive at the very end? What should they look for? What sign? How do you know when you're getting to the end? Well, just imagine that you're living in the future, described in the book of Revelation, described by Daniel, described by our Lord here. You're living in the future. Natural disasters are at a fever pitch, far beyond anything that humanity has ever experienced. Persecution of the people of God is at its maximum level. Believers are being slaughtered. There is persecution the likes of which the world has never seen. At the same time, there is false religion abounding under the leadership of the Antichrist. It's a very hard world. It will be a world more difficult to live in than any point in human history. And those true believers are going to be like the martyrs under the altar saying, "How long, O Lord, how long? How long is this going to go on? Because this is way more stress than we can handle. How can we possibly know when the end is going to come? If you think it's important now, hey, how important will it be then?" I'm having a hard time convincing people that it's important now because they're so comfortable. It's hard to get a people stirred up about the return of Jesus Christ because they're not living in terror. In that day, when the world is living in a condition of terror, how are they going to know that the end is near? The answer to that comes in verses 20 to 24, and that's our text. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. That's the key. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is at hand. You say, wait. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies? That's a very familiar sight. That has been a familiar sight for a very, very long time. Certainly 40 years after Jesus said this in 70 A.D., Jerusalem was surrounded by the Roman army who laid siege to the city of Jerusalem, which finally fell in 70 A.D. And when the city of Jerusalem fell in 70 A.D., people did flee into the mountains. Thousands of them fled into the mountains. Many more traveled as refugees to various parts of the world. They were horrible days. Titus Vespasian, son of the emperor Vespasian, came, attacked the city, and killed people until Josephus says he had no more people to kill and no more people to plunder. And then Caesar sent orders to demolish the whole city, flatten it, demolish and flatten the temple, and just leave a portion of the wall, the city wall, and some towers as a testimony to the power of Rome, so that people would know that it was once such a formidable place, evidenced by the greatness of the wall and the towers that was left, and this would be a testimony to Rome's great power. But apart from leaving that, Josephus says there was not enough left of the city to make those that came after believe that it had ever been an inhabited place. Is that what our Lord is talking about? Was He talking about 70 A.D. here? I don't think so. Keep reading. Verse 21, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. That happened then. Let those who are in the midst of the city depart. That happened. Let those who are in the country not enter the city, and they didn't. Then verse 22, because these are the days of vengeance, in order that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Wait a minute here. That language does not lend itself to a 70 A.D. interpretation. These are not the days of vengeance. These are not the events which cause things which have been written to all be fulfilled. The days of vengeance, just take that phrase. That is an Old Testament expression used to describe The coming time of tribulation. It is an Old Testament expression to speak of divine vengeance from God in the end time, the time of Jacob's trouble. You read about the days of vengeance in Isaiah 34, 35, 61, 63. Daniel 12:1 speaks of the days of vengeance. Hosea 9, Micah 5, Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14. You're talking here about the final end, when God's final vengeance falls on the ungodly and on human history. The days of vengeance when all things which are written become fulfilled. That's a sweeping statement. Sweeping statement. When all things which are written become fulfilled. This is far more than what happened in 70 A.D. What are we talking about here? What event are we talking about here? Well, some might suggest the Middle Ages. Some would come along and say, well, the Jews were under siege during the Middle Ages. The first of the Crusades, 1095. The first of the Crusades, they came, sacked Jerusalem, and from then to the 1500s, control over the city of Jerusalem changed many, many times, until finally Suleiman the Magnificent, the great Ottoman Sultan in the early 1500s, conquered Jerusalem. And if you were to go there today, the walls that you see today, the stone walls, the battlements encircling the old city of Jerusalem, belong to the 16th century time of Suleiman, a visible reminder that Jerusalem has been surrounded by armies through its history. Right there's almost 500 years of it. But you couldn't call any of those events during that period of time in the Middle Ages the days of divine vengeance and the fulfillment of everything that has been written. Well, even today, someone might say Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. Not that they are against the edges of the city wall, but there are armies in constant readiness for war surrounding Israel all the time. Ever since they came back in 1948, declared themselves a state, it was immediately after that that a war of independence left the city of Jerusalem divided. Jordan controlling the old city, including the Temple Mount and most of the historic sites. And that only lasted for about 20 years till 1967. You remember the 6 Days War? In the 6 Days War, Israel forces captured the old city, reunified all of Jerusalem. The city came under Jewish control for the first time in centuries. However, more than 30, 40 years later now, Jerusalem is still surrounded by enemies. They are at the heart of an Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Arab leaders worldwide insisting that that land and that city belongs to them and that they have from God, Allah, a mandate to exterminate the Jews. Jerusalem has been surrounded by armies. It is surrounded by armies in a figurative sense right now. Its political position, as you know, in the Middle East is so volatile that at any moment in time, Israel could be attacked by any of these massive enemies that surround it. Is that what this is talking about? Are we talking about now? Is this it? Are we there? Are we seeing the fulfillment of this prophecy and that Jerusalem is surrounded by all these Arab nations who are armed to the teeth and gaining greater weaponry, including nuclear weapons, to come against them? Is that it? No, that's not it. You say, well, what is he talking about? We have to go to Matthew to answer the question. Turn to Matthew 24. Matthew records that our Lord said something even more specific. Our Lord said something even more specific. He said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's the sign. That's the sign that the great part of the tribulation is to begin. That's the sign that the worst is coming and it's the darkest darkness before the dawn. And here he takes it a step further. Verse 15, Matthew 24. When you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. And here's where that phrase is. Let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and he goes through the same series of warnings to get out of the place. If you're on the housetop, don't even go down inside to get your belongings. If you're in a field, don't go back to get your coat. And woe to those who are pregnant, those who nurse babies, even as we saw recorded in Luke. Pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath. There will be a great tribulation. What launches the great tribulation at the midpoint of the 7 years? The great tribulation is the last half, and Daniel points this out even by numbering the days in chapter 12, as the book of Revelation numbers the days. What triggers the last half, the worst half, just prior to Christ's return, what launches that great tribulation is when the armies surround Jerusalem, and there is the committing of what Daniel calls the abomination of desolation. The abomination of desolation. Jesus is very specific. Jesus then relates Daniel's prophecy of the abomination of desolation to the end time. When you see the abomination of desolation, you know that's the time. That's the end time. Right after that, verse 29, comes the tribulation, its final form. The sun is darkened, the moon doesn't give its light, the stars fall, then the sign of the Son of Man appears in the sky. This is all eschatological. This is all in the last days. So our Lord is talking about a period in the end of history when the armies encamp around Jerusalem.